everyone. Thank you for joining in to my session on academic journal writing tips. Today, I'm going to give you 7 top tips on how to prepare a journal article. Now, when we're writing journal articles, there's a number of dilemmas that emerge. First of all, there's so many journals out there. So which one are we going to send it to? But also, a lot of us have anxieties around maybe the paper will be rejected. What does it mean if you get revised or resubmit? And what I want to talk about today are some of the things that I see are important in constructing a journal article that can hopefully get you to the point where your article is at revise and resubmit. You shouldn't consider that a rejection, because actually I see revise and resubmit as a conversation between yourself and the reviewers. And that conversation is increasingly important in terms of knowledge production and our disciplines. So my first tip for you is to choose your audience first. So many of us, and trust me, I've done it more than once, we think, oh, I have this paper I'm going to write, fantastic paper. And we don't think about which journal it's going into before we begin. And that's always a bad idea. You need to step back. You need to think about, okay, what type of article am I writing? Am I trying to write something, as I like to call them, my job security papers very firmly anchored in my discipline that conform to the kind of standards and norms of excellent scholarship in my discipline? Or are you trying to write a paper that will get the attention of policymakers? Those are very different kinds of papers. They require a different writing style, different citation practice, or maybe you're trying to speak to a wider epistemic community, one that might be cross-disciplinary. And again, the writing style, the citation practice is going to change a bit. So choose your audience first, then figure out where you're going to send it, and then start writing. So tip number 2, the one-act play. Now, journal articles should be thought of as a one-act play. So in a one-act play, you set the scene. That's your overall academic debate. What are you talking about? What's important here? Then you introduce the actors, and this includes your empirical and your theoretical focus. What is this play about? Then the play has action that happens. This is your data, presentation, your data, your case, maybe working through an in-depth theoretical argument that you're trying to engage with. And then there's some kind of catharsis, some sort of big conclusion that happens. What does it all mean? And the moral of this play, because our academic journal articles always have a moral, is your theoretical argument or your contribution to the discipline. And that should run throughout the article. I think too many of us imagine that a journal article is more like a multi-act play, and we try to have too much going on. But remember, you only get to have one major action that occurs in a journal article. More than that, and you're probably looking at either 2 or 3 papers or a book. So, tip number 3, storytelling. As academic writers, a lot of us forget that what we're engaged in is a story. We get so bogged down in thinking about what the theoretical contribution is, about how it's positioned in our discipline, these sorts of things, which are very important, that we forget to think about the story that we're telling. And so as you sit down to write an article, you need to think about what is it that shapes the logic for this particular piece of writing. And by this, I mean, are you telling an empirical story? Is it fundamentally the thing you want to get across? Can that be held together through the empirics? Or is what you're trying to get across being held together by your conceptual contribution? Those can be 2 very different types of articles, both of which are effective, both of which are considered legitimate, but will change a bit the structure and your approach into your problem. Now, don't forget to entice the reader. Too often I see papers that begin with, well, in this discipline, we talk about this, and so has talked about that. And this other person has talked about this other thing. And I'm 2-3 paragraphs down and I still don't know why I should be reading this particular article. So remember to grab your reader's attention right away, pull them in, and the quality of your storytelling is going to help you with that. This is also the place where you think about what is your main message or what is the puzzle that you're solving. Think about piquing the curiosity of your reader. For me, I often use creative writing texts as a source of inspiration because they help me to remember the need to bring my reader along and engage them in my text. So, tip number 4, literature reviews. This is most often a requirement in an academic journal article. We need to speak to our wider community and to speak to the literature that's been done. Now, a couple things to remember with a literature review. One is that you're explaining to the reader where you sit within the wider literature. So that's why you want to draw on relevant stuff, some of which may not pertain directly to what you're doing, but you need to show the reader how what you're doing relates to that. But secondly, we're also acknowledging each other. Remember that in academia, recognition is our currency. This is how we get promoted. It's what we're supposed to be seeking in our jobs, or at least one thing in our jobs. And so it's really important that we acknowledge the work of others who have come before us. And as I get older, I'm increasingly find myself becoming much more generous in my citation practice. It doesn't take anything away from what I'm doing to acknowledge what somebody else is doing. But one thing I've seen a lot in literature reviews is a failure to kind of have the literature review analytical enough. So think about whether or not you can classify or maybe name themes or something in the literature. Break it down for the reader, help them to make sense of it. It's not so much just saying what so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that. It's more about, okay, what is the bigger story that is going on here that the literature as a whole brings out for us? And how does that relate to the story that you are telling within your paper? So the literature review is your opportunity to show why your work is important and novel. Tip number 5, map your text. Now, this is something that I started doing when I had a paper that was an absolute complete mess. And when I say map the text, I mean that literally. So there's various ways you can do it. You can print it out and use Post-it notes like they're doing on the in the photograph here, or you can use highlighters or just a pen. You can do it online, but flag for yourself every place that your main points occur and show, look at the flow of it. Does it make sense? Are you building your argument in a logical way? Have you forgotten to introduce the reader to something important for them to understand the point you're making there? And then make absolutely sure that those main points occur in the introduction and in the conclusion, at the beginning and the end of sections. So set up the point, conclude the section with the main point or set of points. And one of my big top tips here is avoid putting your most important statements in the middle of a paragraph or the middle of the section, because you want the reader to come away really thinking about what you said, not what somebody else said. So when you're making your point or at the end of your section, it should conclude with some of your ideas. And I often see people conclude a section with a quote by another author. You can quote that author, but put your stuff last. So tip number 6, cut and paste. And this is, of course, linked to tip number 5. So as I'm mapping my article, what I do is I copy and paste, I suppose, more than cut and paste, but I copy and paste every place that I think I've said something important, and I put it all on one piece of paper. And then I sit down and I read that piece of paper, and that helps me tremendously to make sure that my argument is coherent. It helps me to edit out repetitions. It can often, I mean, what's very typical for me is I'll have articulated my argument in the introduction or the conclusion, or maybe both. But actually, somewhere in the middle of the paper, I've said it much more elegantly. And so then this is my opportunity to move those statements around. I can take the most elegant articulation and put it somewhere in the paper where it's going to get the most attention. It helps me to check for consistency. And then one of the things I do is I take all, not every single one of them, but I take these distillations of my main points, my main arguments, and I literally cut and paste them into my introduction and my conclusion. And then you have to edit it. So you don't want your paper to be all repetitive. But by doing that, I make sure that I've actually captured those points in the introduction and conclusion, which is where they need to occur. So finally, tip number 7, we're still on mapping. Map your contributions. So think about, again, in this process of mapping the article and mapping your main points, you also want to map it onto the wider literature and the wider conversation that you want to have. Now, when you do this, you want to think about different levels of abstraction. So at the most abstract level, you're going to be speaking to your discipline or maybe a wider literature. What is your contribution? How does what you're doing contribute and add to what has gone on before? You're also going to be speaking to a particular epistemic community. That's maybe a sub debate or a sub contribution, not a sub contribution, but a sub debate within your discipline, but for whom you're speaking to a very specific group of people. You're going to have a set of empirical contributions. And what are these contributions? What's new here? Think about how it relates to policy debates. One of the things that we see very often are people not being bold enough. They're really not saying enough how what they have done contributes. And most often I see that occur because authors have failed to think about the different kinds of audiences that they can speak to. So articulating your empirical contributions usually pretty easy. Oftentimes, articulating how you fit within your epistemic community can be easy. But zooming out into the wider discipline and literature or translating what you're saying for policy is more difficult. But I think it's really worthwhile trying to do this so that you can kind of end your article with a bang. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me. These are my top tips, and best of luck with your article writing.